Welcome to Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw. I'm a professor of school psychology in the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. And in this session of Building Research Relevance, we're going to talk a little bit about the nuance of implementation and why this is really important if we're going to build a relevant research is to have a nuanced approach to implementation. And this happens a lot, and it happens a lot when we do workshops, when we try to get people to implement a new idea. And that's fine. We do this a lot. We educate people, we support people. There's a lot of science of implementation that's working out, and it's becoming a very exciting field of study. But when we try to create a true evidence-based practice, sometimes we go in a bad direction. And I want to talk about maybe a better direction to present and facilitate new information, create a knowledge translation that can really be working and can be credible and can be relevant. So, to create a true evidence-based practice, what we typically try to do is to find the best possible interventions and the basics of practice that have some evidence supporting them. What we tend to do right now is talk about evidence-based practice as if it were a good housekeeping seal of approval. It's like, bingo, you got evidence-based, that's great. Well, we've talked about that in the past, and it's not necessarily so. It's more of a marketing thing than anything else. But what we often talk about now, when we want someone to believe what we're saying, and we want to be credible, and we want them to implement our ideas, we always preface everything by saying it's scientific. And if you're really advanced, you not only have scientific, but you have pictures of brain and use neurobabble frequently, as if that made any difference whatsoever other than to make you sound more scientific, more hardcore scientific. We got to remember what science is. And a lot of our work isn't really science, but more scholarship. Nonetheless, if we're going to say that the practices we use and the practices that are relevant are scientific, we need to think about what we define as science. And I like the functional definitions of science that are used. Carl Sagan used this, Richard Feynman used this. Science is a systematic approach to knowledge generation that's really designed to keep us from fooling ourselves. And we're the easiest people to fool. I love that quote. I think it's a really good one. I think that was a Feynman quote. Could be Sagan. I don't know. But what we do is we don't tend to do this. We tend to like fooling ourselves. We use the research, we cherry pick the research that's consistent with our worldview, that helps our career, that leads to financial gain for us, or just makes us feel good. Kind of a virtue signaling situation. That's really common. So we're going to explore some of these concepts and how we can make things a little bit better so that we are more credible. More credible equals more relevant. Not 100%, but you got to have credibility before you have relevance. So the big problem here is when we implement something, a teacher implements a reading program, or a psychologist implements a therapy option. It's a binary choice. You either do it or you don't do it. That's it. But the problem is the research evidence is usually more nuanced. So it's rather than do it or don't do it, sometimes the differences are very small. We have a lot of people who do presentations. In fact, probably the most effective presenters I've heard, they will go to the mat for a program or a technique that may have kind of a 52%, 48% improvement over the unfavored treatment. Sometimes it's as much as 1% of the variance accounted for by using one method over another. And people will treat it like it is the gospel, like it is the only way to go. They have this missionary zeal to present it as this is the only way to do things because science says so. Or neuroscience says so, which even ups the ante, but not really the facts. So this idea of we got something that works best, and we should use the things that work best. But the problem when we do this is it's a real problem. When we use these black and white ideas of this is the only way to go, we create problems. We see this a lot, and there's a phrase, and I get it, I know why we do it, but it's a little problematic for me. What we call the science of reading. This is a thing now. We follow the science of reading. It's not terrible, it's a good thing. But quite often, the label of calling it the science of reading is being used as a cudgel against other techniques that may be 49% effective as opposed to the 51% effective. And this creates this idea there's only one way, when in fact there are multiple ways. Yes, if I could choose, would I choose the 51% over the 49%? Yes, I would. No question. For policy, that's the way we do things. But we do need to not quite have so much zeal, so much idea that this is the one and only true method. The reason why that's problematic isn't that big of a deal. It's that what happens when new research comes out and we need to change. Science should be dynamic. We should change based on new results. We're never at a truth. Science doesn't give us a truth. It gives us a pathway to truth. But we do things that make us more money or that we've already invested time and energy in. That's what we focus on. But when you think about it, if you're working on a particularly therapeutic technique, for example, are there some people for whom the less favored intervention, that's only effective 49% versus 51%, are there people who respond better to the less favored intervention? The answer is, of course there are. Of course there are. So we're really probably doing poor work for some people. Now, if you're making policy, that's fine. It's not that big a deal. You expect to have that happen when you make policy. But if you're a psychologist or a teacher implementing evidence-based practices, and you're trying to do this, knowing that some people might be more responsive to something that you think is the worst thing in the world because you're using science, and it favors this one by 1%. Okay, it's problematic. It's really not a great way to go. Sometimes it's easier because when you're trying to do knowledge translation, you're trying to tell a story. It's easier to tell the black and white story. This works, this doesn't. When that's rarely ever true. But we try to use this black and white story because we somehow think it's necessary to convince people to implement a program. We have to be clear. This is the one, the only, the true way. And sometimes you have the other side use the same kind of arguments. We've seen this. In fact, it's very famous in education. It's known as the reading wars of using the phonologic-based types of reading versus the whole language type of reading. And it's actually considered wars because both sides say theirs is the one and only true way. Both can't be correct. And this is the big problem where we affect research relevance. When you have this is the only way versus that is the only way, when in fact there's some nuance there. But when we make these cases, and both can clearly not be correct, that this is the only way, that is the only way, both sides lose credibility. And research becomes less relevant, less credible throughout. We need to tell stories. I'm a big fan of storytelling in terms of knowledge translation, but we need to tell the full nuanced story. We need to have research that focuses on for whom, under what conditions, where, when, developmentally, what resources are required, what equity issues are addressed by each intervention. And if we tell that story with the nuance that this idea works best for this people under these circumstances at this time in their development, here are the resources required to do it, here are some of the potential equity issues. If we do our research this way, we can tell a nuanced story. One that the consumers who receive this information won't say, I have to choose this or that. They can say, what are the guidelines upon which you make these decisions? Once you do this, you have a very compelling story for implementation. But thinking people are so simple-minded as to say it's this or that, you either do this or you feed them a bag of poop. Those are your two options. And making the distance makes it easier, increasing the true distance makes it easier to make a binary decision is not really accurate. So all sides lose credibility when we have reading wars and other approaches. We need to change our research methods so we do have information for people to make good decisions based on who, what, where, why, when, with what resources, what equity issues, what legal issues, what ethical issues. All those needs to be part of research. That's what makes research relevant. But we need to not lose entire credibility for all research. When in fact people go, I don't know which is right, this one or that one, I'll just do the one I like. Now we've defeated the entire purpose of the scientific enterprise, which is to keep us from fooling ourselves. This is the big mess we have. In reality, it's nuanced. If we come up with a brilliant intervention that is 1 or 2% better than previous interventions, we're awesome. It doesn't mean those other interventions need to be thrown in the dumpster. But the issue is when you make these binary decisions, and this is the greatest thing, this is the worst thing, what happens is when there's new developments that does improve things a little bit better, it doesn't destroy the credibility of the old idea. It can replace it. But when we make these binary things, this works, this doesn't, there's a new improvement, maybe a third way. There's absolutely no room for growth. There's no room for innovation. There's no room for new science. There's no room for new ideas, new research, new things to be implemented. There's no space for a dynamic improvement. Dynamic improvement is a big part of a scientist practitioner model. This is why I'm not really a fan of things like manualized interventions in psychotherapy, because those are great for research, but they're terrible for clinical practice because it carves it in stone. This is how you do it. You do it cut and dry. There's not a lot of room to move. A manualized intervention that perhaps changes every year based on integrating new ideas and new research might be a decent way to go. But we do need to consider all the credibility issues that happen when we start making these cases with a missionary zeal, that this is the science of reading, this is the evidence supporting this versus that. In fact, there's room for a lot of different things. There certainly are many cases where there are interventions that are not the best in the whole world for policy for everybody, but for some people work very, very well. We see this a lot in medicine, where there are certain dietary practices that are really not particularly healthy, but for some people are essential, such as the high-fat diets for people with certain types of seizure disorders and things of this nature. These happen. These can happen. But if we're going to be credible, we need to understand nuance. Research needs to evolve in that it says that it values the nuance and allows decision makers to make the decision on when, why, what, where, when. I think that's it. When, why, what, where, when. And the resources required, all this stuff, the training, the time, the materials, all this stuff needs to be put into any type of methodology. Then you have relevant research. It's about building credibility as a big part of it. And if we do implementation that's less strident, that's more detailed, that's more context specific, what we do is we actually make more room for science. And we make more room for a credible scientist practitioner model that uses actual evidence-based practices as more than a marketing tool. That says somebody somewhere did a case study that shows this intervention works, therefore it's evidence-based. That's a continuum. But we need our research to develop these skills. This is important for making things relevant. So thanks very much. I appreciate your time. And next session is actually the final session of the Building Research Relevance series. But we'll talk about that and what the next steps are. But for now, thanks very much and keep building relevant research. Thank you.